Hey everybody, it's Ian. Welcome back to Introduction to Folklore, and today we're talking about riddles and proverbs. Riddles and proverbs aren't necessarily naturally bedfellows because they're kind of two different things, but they have a certain interrelationship with them. One is that, of course, they are short. A riddle is a very short verbal genre. A proverb is a very short verbal genre. And they fall under the category of what has been sometimes unfortunately called a minor genre. Minor seems to imply insignificance, but that's sort of a hierarchical difference. But really, they're minor in terms of length more than anything else, as opposed to narratives, which are longer for the most part. Riddles are short. They might be a tiny little verse, or even just a sort of sentence fragment with an implied answer. Proverbs are typically, a sentence. Their pithiness, their shortness, their brevity is part of their appeal. So they're included that way. The other way that they are related to each other is that they almost always imply some kind of metaphoricity, but in two very different ways. Proverbs use a metaphor to explain some kind of situation. Let's just sort of start with definitions. And that proverbs are opportunities. How should I put this? Proverbs are conventionalized wisdom. Proverbs are moments where we have an expression, and the emphasis is on the we, but we have an expression that suggests some kind of settled thought, some kind of idea of how the world actually operates. So let me give you an example. And the classic example is if you come and ask me a question. Let's say you ask me a question about whether you should, you've been offered a job. You've got a job offer. You don't know whether you should take it or not. There are a couple of things to consider first. It's very attractive, but there are drawbacks and so on. And I say, hey, he who hesitates is lost. And it's like, oh, right. And so, that is a good piece of advice in some ways. And it's a good piece of advice that's coming through me, but not from me, as it were. In a way, one of the things that conventionalized wisdom does is that it allows you to really remind a person of what a group already would say about this situation. Conversely, same exact situation. You've got a job offer, it's very lucrative, it's very suggestive, but there are drawbacks to it. What should you do? And I could easily just say, look before you leap, which is, in a way, the exact opposite. And you could go, of course, because that's what our group tells you to do. And so they're conflicting pieces of wisdom. They are two different answers to the same thing. But most importantly, they are not coming from me, because who am I? I'm just some jerk. But if I remind you that our group, the group that we belong to, has a kind of orientation in how one should operate within this world, you are like, oh, okay, it's conventionalized. It's of the group. It is normative, and it's also, as I said, most often metaphor. The look before you leap is clearly advice about jumping, but isn't only applicable to jumping. The proverb is a remarkably, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a remarkably slippery piece of a folk culture. For one thing, they are impenetrable. There are these sort of levels of meaning that are associated with them. There's a guy, I'm going to put his name on the screen because I'm not looking it up right now, but he refers to the idea of a paremiological minima, where he suggests that in order to actually be conversant within a culture, to actually sort of be a member of that culture, and he was using specifically Russian culture. There are like 300 proverbs that you need to understand. And so you can be a language learner, but to sort of grasp the culture, you need to know and have a facility with these proverbs. And it's really kind of fascinating. Going back to the look before you leap issue, there is this role that proverbs play in terms of the conventional wisdom in communities that are primarily oral, because they are the group's understanding of events. So they're used in trials. John Messenger in the 1950s wrote this classic article about the role of proverbs in Nigerian court systems and so tribal systems, and basically making the point that if you have a court case, you have a judge, you have two advocates, one for each of the conflicting parties. And the advocates basically argue what the outcome should be, what the decision should be, by adverting to the salient proverbs. And then the judge basically says, no, that is the correct one, that's the correct reading, that's the incorrect reading, and so on. So it's this battle of case law, which isn't actually fundamentally different from how Western law works. I mean, Western law, the North American court system that you might be familiar with, and you see where they invoke cases, they invoke precedent. The precedent that they invoke is, this case has been settled as I can refer you to the judgment of X. In this case, this almost exactly same situation was judged this way. That becomes precedent, and that precedent enters into the cumulative understanding. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel will say, that's not the relevant case to base your decision on, Your Honor. It should be based on this, because this is more relevant. And as you see in this one, it went the opposite way. And then that's presented to the judge, it's presented to the jury, and basically what is the summary of that, and who wins is based on precedent. So proverbs are based on precedent. Here's the quote from John Messenger. During a case in which a chronic thief was accused of robbery, the plaintiff aroused considerable antagonism toward the defendant early in the trial by employing the following proverb: if a dog plucks palm fruits from a cluster, he does not fear a porcupine. A cluster from the oil palm tree contains numerous sharp needles that make handling it extremely hazardous. Therefore, a dog known to pick palm fruits certainly would be unafraid to touch a porcupine. The maxim implies that the accused is the logical suspect, since he was a known thief and lived close to the person who was robbed, and many in the audience regarded the trial as a mere formality. His guilt came to appear doubtful, however, in the light of evidence produced during the proceedings, and just before the justices were to retire, he presented an adage that was instrumental in gaining his acquittal: a single partridge flying through the bush leaves no path. Partridges usually travel close to the ground in coveys and can be followed by the trail of bent and broken grass they leave behind. In using this proverb, the accused likened himself to a single bird, without sympathizers to lend him support, and called upon the tribunal to disregard the sentiments of those in attendance and to overlook his past misdemeanors and judge the case as objectively as possible. So you have this instance of this using proverbs to be the overarching metaphor through which motivations, through which human actions, through which probable cause, and so on should be read. So it's quite fascinating. Metaphors, pithiness, and controlling the body of the having an influence in how the group understands itself, how the group bends towards justice, how the group bends towards action, through these pithy expressions. And proverbs are plentiful, and I highly recommend you seek out proverbs as a sort of guiding principle. I'm really interested in proverbs because they are these fixed forms that are then applied in a variety of contexts, and they can be adapted towards particular contexts. They can be what are sometimes called anti-proverbs, where the proverb is intentionally changed to subvert its meaning or to be sort of a pun of some description. but it requires you understanding the proverb and the original proverb to begin with. So it has that element to it. But I think if we sort of take it even one step further back, we have the idea of these fixed forms, which are conventional responses, conventional understandings that circulate in a group, and are immediately found resonant, and you can see it in a whole bunch of different parallel situations. And really, that's kind of how memes function. Proverbs are clearly words, and memes, or the graphic image meme that we typically understand in terms of like the Icon has cheeseburger sort of meme, is graphic and words. But they become a way of quickly condensing some kind of real world situation into a simple and perhaps over simple explanatory device. For example, if you have some kind of like conflict of interpretations where the difference is who is right and who is wrong is somewhat ambiguous, if you could take that image and put the two screaming women and the cat and the salad next to each other, that sort of classic image, all of a sudden it's like I am illustrating that this is an intractable situation by using this image, and we all know, oh, okay, this is an intractable situation. So it functions very much in the same way that a proverb functions, and it doesn't mean it isn't subject to variation, but you kind of have to know the general idea before you can grasp that variation has occurred. And then we have riddles. And riddles are different a little bit, but they primarily deal with some kind of metaphor. Or really, it's metaphor that is closer to simile than anything else. But what is more, they kind of introduce people to slipperiness, because the metaphor might sort of surprise you, because it's a straightforward question. And you are fundamentally asked to guess what the metaphor is. So here's just an example from a website, thefatherly.com, 85 best riddles for kids that aren't too confusing. So it's just that, the ground zero of what a riddle could be. And some of them are puns and so on, but here's one, Riddle 11. You cut me, slice me, dice me, and all the while you cry. What am I? And what's going on? And the question, you're all university types, you could probably figure this one out. And the answer is an onion. But if you imagine that all of a sudden you have this idea of the personification of an onion, the personification of something that is attacked. So it's a metaphor that is violent. So it's a description that is violent. And then, we are doing this, but the irony is that the person who is doing the cutting is the one who is weeping, and I feel nothing. That introduces a child to the idea that language has meanings. Language has multiple meanings, and that the absolute straightforward meaning of language is not always self-apparent. That once you introduce the concept of sort of misdirection, because that's really fundamentally what it is. It almost works in the same way as a joke works, in that the words send you off in one particular direction that is puzzlement. It's like, this doesn't make sense to me. What kind of person would not I can't believe I'm analyzing this lame-ass riddle, but it's a good illustration of it. What kind of person would have no reaction to being sliced and diced and cut? Moreover, why would it be the aggressor who has the reaction, the emotive reaction? It's like, okay, well, we are transcending these clear-cut categories. So riddles become these introductions to the notion that language is not an absolute, that language actually functions on the level of symbol, and that symbols can be ambiguous and polyvalent. So they're kind of a wonderful thing in that way. They are, as always, I do want to emphasize that they are also fun, and that we should never forget the idea that fun is a justification for something in and of itself, because they can delight. But their delight comes from this startling recognition that one has been, that because of the ambiguities of language, and because of the artistry of the teller at playing with those ambiguities of language, the individual has been misdirected, temporarily misdirected, and then the answer resolves. The answer has to make sense as long as you're able to add the additional moment to it. So I want to take you back to The Hobbit, which is one of the great illustrations of the use of the riddle as a form of contest. And riddling contests are reasonably rife in the history of folklore, and you see them in tales a lot. So how often they happen in real life is up for grabs. But the fact that they become a convenient battling moment in narrative is indicative of something. Not to mention which that we now have these riddles that come to us because they are integral to certain versions of Märchen, or certain versions of even myth in some ways. You talk about like the myth of the Sphinx and the riddle of the Sphinx and so on, and it's like, I mean, it's an important moment in the Oedipus myth, while simultaneously it allows for that riddle that has been extended through what would it be now, 3,000-4,000 years, and it's not language dependent because it's image dependent, but it isn't linguistically dependent. Proverbs are a lot like song in that because hold on, let me just double back a little bit. Sometimes when riddles are a consequence of wordplay, riddles do not translate well. I'm going to give you some other even lamer examples from thefatherly.com. What is the richest nut? A cashew. Okay, fine. Lame, but there you go. It requires that you have the English word cashew, you have the English word cash. And if you don't have parallel terms and parallel linguistic contexts, that doesn't work. On the other hand, if you have riddles that are much about metaphor and aren't really about the slipperiness of language, you have things like the myth of the Sphinx, which I'm presuming you know, but just in case you don't, the riddle of the Sphinx, where what crawls on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 legs at night in the evening. And the answer is a man, a person, but using gendered language, a man in terms of baby baby in the morning, walking on 2 legs at noon in the middle of life, and then on a cane in the evening at the end of life. So it requires the metaphoricity of a lifespan being the daylight hours, which you can argue can be easily understood, and all it really requires is the concept of a cane otherwise. So there you have it. So it can transcend language. Proverbs don't, because they are much more linguistically based, and they often include things like rhyme and so on. They don't travel well. So they often are embedded in language histories and don't necessarily hop from linguistic group to linguistic group. That doesn't mean that there can't be analogous ones. The red sky at night, sailors delight, red sky at morning, sailors take warning, weather lore one, which actually is very descriptive. It has very little to do. Isn't based on pun and isn't based on metaphor. It's actually it works, at least on the East Coast. It works. That as a piece of verse is English language and doesn't necessarily work other places. But you can find other proverbial expressions in other languages that do the same thing. There's a Japanese proverb that has the exact same meaning and content. It's just not a translation of one. But it's because weather is weather, and the sun basically works the same way. But I digress. So it introduces the listener to metaphoricity. It introduces the listener to assonance when we're talking about riddles that are fundamentally puns, because it's like there's a relationship between sounds and words. I mean, what is a pun? Basically, it's the idea that something that is either similar sounding or identical sounding have 2 different meanings. So you can have that whether it's just by changing a word and turning it into just like a sort of a groaner in terms of the words are almost the same, or by that cashew thing, flipping it around, you've got this sense that there's not 100% one-to-one pure correlation between a sound and a meaning, because language is richer than the sounds that we employ for them. So that's kind of an eye-opener once you first think about it. And the thing is, you know this already because you're grown-ups. And so this shouldn't be, the idea that words have two meanings shouldn't necessarily be surprising to you at this point. But that's because there is this sort of pedagogical function that riddles do. And if you can think back to your childhoods, you will see how much riddles are actually used. And if you see back to your childhoods, you can see how much sort of proverbs are used, that you're taught in many ways through adverting to these sort of conventional things. And now do this, don't do that. And they're done in sort of simple, memorable ways. The thing about a proverb, I know I keep on hopping back and forth, but it's kind of fun because you do want to think of these things together. The thing about a proverb is that it is memorable. It is catchy. It's pithy. It condenses this thing into something that is memorable and illustrative of something. And so, okay. And so if you take this piece of the semantic content of a piece of wisdom, an approach, something that your group is saying is a way of being in the world, and you attach it to something that is memorable, all of a sudden you just have this rich node of understanding and can use it forward. So it makes sense that education relies on either things that are kind of are actual proverbs, or are proverbial-ish. Let's see if we can condense it down to its essence. Let's see if we can oversimplify is unfair, but see if we can turn it from a complicated thought into a simple thought. And of course, new ones emerge. And Wolfgang Meter, who is the proverb scholar, he's just the proverb scholar. He's the guy in the English language, and has been for arguably the past 45 years on the study of Proverbs. And he's the guy in German, as if that weren't enough. But he's done a lot of work on these proverbs that are really part of our consciousness, but they're not age old. The proverb doesn't have to be new. We can talk about sort of the proverbial expression of being voted off the island, which comes from Survivor. So that's since the year 2000. A picture's worth 1,000 words, which was a I can't remember if it's Kodak or Polaroid, but it was advertising campaign in the 1950s. If the glove don't fit, you must acquit, coming from the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995, 1996, can't remember the precise year, on and on and on, that these ideas enter into the group and are pithy enough expressions that they immediately summarize some kind of thought, and we can use them. So they're kind of fun. They are remarkably orienting. We tend to move beyond it as we grow older. We don't really tell each other riddles that often, at least not in the 21st century. But we'll still every now and then invoke the old proverb. And the fact that we can invoke proverbs really ties in and lets it be known that we are talking to our group. There's this wonderful moment that it came out in, of all things, it was in the 2000 election. And someone basically, because let me just make this clear, because Proverbs, as I said, that's a premiological minimum. And that the idea is that knowing the proverb is one of those things that kind of makes you know that you are in the group. And so groups have their own proverbs. And they can be somewhat unrecognizable, unfathomable, silly, maybe, to outsiders. And there was this, George W. Bush was campaigning, and he was saying, you're too busy pointing out the splinter in my eye to realize that you got a big old beam in yours. It's something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm the splinter in the beam is what's critical. And a reporter, or some political commentator, basically said, I don't know why he was using this convoluted metaphor to where he could have been saying, that's like the pot calling the kettle black, But the reporter, the political commentator, didn't realize that what he's actually doing is quoting Jesus and the idea of the mote and the beam. So he's using a biblical proverb that he knew his audience would recognize because his audience was scripture literate. And the reporter didn't. And so all of a sudden, this reporter is like making fun of Bush, but Bush knew his audience and knew the proverbial understanding that he used. The proverbial understanding of his crowd, and therefore when he invokes this, he's not simply invoking this as a piece of common sense. It becomes a shibboleth of sorts of being part of the same group. So that's a kind of a fascinating moment. And the use of Proverbs in political rhetoric is startling and fascinating. And again, an argument that Wolfgang Meeder makes an awful lot. But he's written entire books on Obama and Proverbs. There we go, Wolfgang Meeder's Yes We Can. Books on Obama's use of Proverbs. He's done it on Lincoln. He's done it on Churchill. He's done it on Hitler, for that matter. It's not always positive by any stretch of the imagination, but the way that speech is used to take a rhetorical position and locate that rhetorical position within the common sense of the group, they do that through proverb. So it's a kind of a fascinating field. And there we go. So the question of the week is basically that. Is there a piece of conventional wisdom that you use, that you have, that can be sort of a pithy phrase? I've been using English language examples, of course, because I speak English, but maybe English is not your first language and you have some from your own language group. Feel free to share because they are kind of fascinating. It's fascinating the thought process that underlies that proverb, like what it means. It's also fascinating the references, especially if it's a metaphorical one. I have a friend in Russia who's always telling me these proverbs, and eventually I have to go, let me guess, it has to do with a bear, right? And 95% of the time I'm right. There's a bear that you're not supposed to disturb or something. So anyway, it's just kind of a neat area. So that's the question of the week. Piece of conventional wisdom. What does it mean? How is it used? And so on. Otherwise, until that time, my friends, I will talk to you later, and be well. And I've always said I'll talk to you later, so I'll say it one more time. I'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.